Okay, it is 8:30. Welcome everyone to this month's Orienteering USA Forum. I'm John Torrance, the VP of Competition. And this month we have one of North America's most experienced mappers, Jeff Teutsch of Navigation Sports Canada, who was the mapper for most recently the North American Championships in Ottawa. Uh, just some housekeeping. Uh, This is being recorded, so if you aren't comfortable being recorded, either leave or limit your participation to what you are comfortable with. When Jeff wants to take questions, please use the hand icon to raise your hand, and we will try to take them in order. I'm not sure how imagery intensive Jeff's presentation will be, but I'm sure there will be some maps. If you want to see them as well as you can, if you're on a computer at least, you want to, if you haven't already, select the three dots, select layout, change that to spotlight, do the three dots again, and change to full screen. And that should give you as large a view as you can get. You may need to hide the messages if you aren't using when you aren't using them. With that, over to you, Jeff.
All right. Thanks, John. So yes, of course, we couldn't do a presentation about mapping or anything in orienteering without showing a few maps. So we will do that. But really, the focus today is not so much on getting into the weeds with mapping. We won't be looking at too many kind of detailed mapping examples. Really, the goal here is to give you a kind of an overview of the different stages of mapping that is involved in mapping at a professional level. So we're going to start there, and then we'll get into really what this evening is all about, which is some tips on getting started with mapping. So there will be stuff in here for those of you that have some more mapping experience, but there's also going to be a huge chunk of this that is really focused on, okay, I'm new to mapping, I don't know where to start, or I've done my first map, and how do I learn more? And that's really going to be what this is about. So I've got probably about 20 minutes, half an hour of material here, and then we'll open this up as a Q&A at the end. So let me just get into the right spot here. So thank you, John, for the brief intro. I'll just add a couple of little things to that. So I've been orienteering since I was a kid. I've competed at world champs and world university champs for Canada a couple times, and gradually, since graduating from university a dozen years ago, I've kind of switched from competing to mapping, coaching, organizing events, to the point where I started Navigation Sports, my business, goodness, 6 years ago now. And have been doing lots of mapping and other things in the intervening time. So starting off, as I was saying, I want to give an overview of everything that goes into high level mapping, so you can see kind of all the parts, and we'll break it down, and then we'll go from there. So I've broken it down into a long list of steps, 11 steps here. Most of the work as a mapper really falls into kind of 7 of those steps, and those can kind of get grouped together into ends up being kind of 3 or 4 steps here. So the first thing, of course, is finding an area to map, and acquiring permissions, and put those 2 up front. Obviously, finding the area needs to be at the front. But I would also highlight that it's important to make sure that you have permission before you start mapping, rather than before you host the first event. And the reasons for that are twofold. One is you're potentially trespassing while you're making the map, while you're doing the field work. But the other thing is, it sucks to put tons of time or tons of money, if you're looking at it from a club's perspective, into a brand new map, to only find out that either you can't use it at all, or you can use it for maybe one event, but then you can't use it for years down the road, right? So make sure you're taking those steps before you actually get into it. Um, and um, and then you can get into the interesting stuff. So we look at acquiring base material. So whether that's lidar, um, data from the city in terms of building shapes, might be tree locations, different things like that, and preparing that material, putting it all together into your OCAD or your Open Orienteering Mapper file. Um, and so we can group those together into data collection and processing. So that's kind of the first part. Um, as a professional mapper, I go through all of these steps myself. If you're working with a team or you've got a mentor or something, this is the kind of thing that maybe somebody might prepare for you for your first map. If you have somebody guiding you through that, if you want to focus on just a part of this whole process, this is a part that it's easy to say, hey, John, hey, Joseph, can you help me find the data, pull it together, put it into OCAD for me, and then you can kind of go from there, right? So the next handful of steps here, 5 through 8, get grouped together as well. Nope, sorry. 5 is its own step, and then 6 through 8 is the next step. So drawing contours and other info from base material. So we'll look at this a little bit more, but I have the raw base material, and then before I go out in the field, I tend to spend maybe 10, 12 hours per square kilometer prepping that, doing some of the drawing before I go out in the field. And then there comes the actual fieldwork portion. So there's the fieldwork itself. There's drawing some of that. These days with whether you're using a tablet or a phone, but you're drawing right into the software, that post fieldwork drafting does get reduced, but it doesn't get brought down to 0. And then this is something that I think often gets overlooked is there's an editing process. So the first draw of your map should not necessarily be considered your final. And especially as newer orienteers, you might find if you're doing a 2 square kilometer project, you might find that you've learned a lot over the space of that, and you might want to revisit the stuff you did at the beginning of the project, and do some editing on that, right? So just like any published document, whether it's a book or a newsletter or whatever, you're going to write your first draft, and then you'll do some editing on it. So you can, of course, skip that, but you're going to get a better product if you go through and you look at it again and you review it and make sure everything's consistent and so on. Then there's the course setting, not really the responsibility of the mapper, but it does tie in because that's going to affect how your map, if you've got a big map, how it gets cropped, what parts of the map you're going to show, and that might impact your map layout, which sometimes, not necessarily always, becomes the responsibility of the mapper. And then I always like to include this last one, the printing piece, because it's really important to remember that you are not creating an electronic map file. Well, you are, but the ultimate goal is a map that looks good printed on paper. And so keeping that in mind as that last step is key. We often overlook that, and it can impact what the experience of the folks using the map in the event, right? So we're not going to talk about some of these steps today. We're going to go through kind of those 3 main ones: the data collection and processing, pre-fieldwork map drawing, and the fieldwork and final drawing. And we'll go through those because those are the I guess where the most work gets done. It's kind of the core of mapping. So before we go into those, just want to remind folks again about the importance of getting permission, right? Having that map or creating that map does not imply permission. So, and if you're going off trail, keep that in mind. And the other piece, this doesn't really belong in here, but I'm going to put it in here anyway as a reminder to everybody when you're starting mapping. It's a good idea to tell people when you're going out in the woods alone. The least you can do is to tell a partner, tell a friend, tell somebody that, hey, I'm going to be out at such and such a location mapping today. I'll text you when I get back, so you know that I'm out of the woods, right? So just a couple of reminders in there, and we will move on. So The I've taken this from a different presentation that I've done, um, but basically those you see those three steps down the left side here, um, and when I'm doing a full on map, I'm going through all of these main steps. I have done projects where I've done the drawing work, but I haven't actually done the field work. It's a remote project, or I'm doing all of that for a client that wants to do the field work themselves. So I've done these kind of hand drawn maps where I skip that last step, and then there is of course lots of folks these days doing some simple stuff on like Karttapullautin maps, sort of auto generated maps, where really the only step that is involved here is the data collection and processing. So I put this diagram together just really to show how much time and effort gets spent in all of them. So they're not equal, right? The vast majority of the time is spent in that field work and final drawing. At least if you're doing a full-on like an event, a map that would get used for like a U.S. Nationals or a North American Championships. And as a professional mapper, that of course is where things get really expensive, is the number of hours spent on that field work. So, for example, the North American Championships map John was mentioning was a little over 6 square kilometers. The whole project was about 500 hours of time. 400 of that was in that field work and final drawing. So huge amounts of time there. I've thrown some numbers in here. This is on a per square kilometer basis. So anywhere from kind of 2 to 10 hours for data collection and processing, 5 to 15 hours per square kilometer for field work, or sorry, for the pre-field work drawing. And I'll show you what that looks like. I'll take a couple minutes to do that in a little bit. And then anywhere from 30 to roughly 70 hours per square kilometer for the fieldwork and final drawing, depending on the complexity of the terrain, the physicality of the terrain. Also, the distance from the parking lot makes a difference. On those big projects, the first day I might work close to the parking lot, but towards the end of the project, I might be doing the stuff in the far end where it's an hour of time spent walking in and out to the section that I'm actually mapping, right? So that's a huge chunk of that time. So that's a rough ballpark. It really depends. It will also, of course, depend from mapper to mapper, but these are roughly some of the hours that the kind of the range of hours that I tend to spend on projects. So this is for forest specifically. If we look at sprints, it changes a little bit, and the time is much more evenly split between the pre-field work map drawing and the final, the field work and the final drawing. So with sprints, there tends to be a lot more you can do from aerial photos, maybe from Google Street View and things like that. And it's much more efficient to do that drawing sitting at the computer than to try to do it during your field work. And so we'll do a lot more of that beforehand and then go out and try to do the field work kind of basically as quickly as possible. But still, we're looking at anywhere from, I would say anywhere from about 70 to about 120 to 130 hours per square kilometer for a sprint map. Tends to be a lot more time intensive on a per square kilometer basis than a forest map for a variety of reasons, but there's more detail packed in because we're looking at a smaller scale, a smaller scale or a larger scale map, I should say. All right, so let's dive into some of these specifics here. So in the data collection and processing, I've talked a little bit about what this looks like. So you need to find the data, and then you need to process the LiDAR to turn it into. It starts at what they call a point cloud. It's a series of dots in space, and you want to turn that into contours. You have to process that, and then taking all of your different bits of data, pulling it all together, and putting it together into your project. So what goes into this? You need to know where to find the data. So you're looking for what the open data is. You need to find the shape files, find your aerial imagery, whatever that is. You need at least a basic understanding of georeferencing to be able to pull it together. You might have different data in different coordinate reference systems, and pull that together. So this is where sometimes this is a good part of the process to ask somebody else with more experience to help you with. and you need, of course, a little bit of experience with the various tools that you're going to use. So whether it's OCAD or Open Orienteering Mapper, maybe QGIS, you typically don't need that to start, but some different tools that you can use. So let's take a look at a couple of things here. So I've got a couple of things prepared. So first off, let's look briefly at, and we'll include this link at the end of my presentation, and I'll send it in the chat as well. This is the NOAA National Map Viewer. I have not used it much because I have not actually done any mapping in the US myself, but I'm certainly somewhat familiar. So let's say we want to do a map here around Portland here. We can draw a little rectangle, and up on the right, it's going to show us our different sources of LiDAR, and we can click through and pick the piece of data that we want, download it, and I think you can choose what coordinate reference system to download it in, and get your LiDAR that way. The other thing that's worth looking at, particularly if you're looking at sprint maps, is actually, I'm just going to close this. Is your open data. So your open data is most large cities and urban centers these days have some data that you can use. So I would typically search for the city. I'm going to use Boston as an example. Open data portal. So every city will have a portal of some kind where you can access this data, and it tends to be pretty easy to find. Pops up. So here's the Boston site, and you can search around. I'm going to jump through, try to keep this pretty quick to geospatial, and you can look for things here. So it's found a whole bunch of things already: street trees, park trees. I can download those in a variety of formats, which I won't get into now, and it'll show you your locations. If I do buildings, this is one of the really common ones that cities tend to have, and also really handy. And I can download all my building shapes to pop right into my map. And then yeah, there's a variety of tools you can use, Karttapullautin or OCAD to process the LiDAR. In the case of LiDAR, there's a lot going on there, which we unfortunately don't have time to get into in a half-hour presentation. So the next step would be the pre-fieldwork map drawing. So if we're talking about LiDAR, then we're talking about drawing our major features from our LiDAR and our aerial imagery, which the aerial imagery comes into play more in the sprint maps. We're going to draw, at least my process, and I think most mappers' processes these days involves drawing the contours from your LiDAR before you go out and do your field work. And there's lots of other details you can draw from your LiDAR as well. So what do you need to know? You need to have a little bit of experience looking at your LiDAR, being able to interpret that, experience with the different products that you get from the raw LiDAR. So you can get these hill shades, these slope gradients, intensity images, the contours themselves, obviously. And then it helps to have some experience drawing, but you have to start somewhere. So get in there and just start trying to draw your contours. And of course, knowledge of your International Orienteering Federation, the mapping specifications. So I'm going to show a couple of quick examples here. And again, reminder that this is my process as a professional mapper. This is not where you would start, but I do want to give everybody kind of a sense of that. So this here, oops, let me pull it up onto my screen that I'm sharing. This here is a project that I just got a contract for in Ontario. And what you see here is I've got my LiDAR contours in blue and orange. So the orange are the depressions, the negative contours, and the blue is the positive. I've got 5 meter, the thickest lines are 5 meter contours. And then I've got 1 meter and actually a 25 centimeter or quarter meter contours. So I can see lots and lots of detail there. The color in green and yellow and white is the vegetation height. canopy height from the forest. And then I do also have another shaded layer underneath there. And so this is where I would start to go in and I would start to draw my contours. So I don't want to just use, I could hide my my 25 and 1 meter contours, and I could just use my raw LiDAR here. So if I hide these and hide, oh, never mind. I don't have this set up this way. Apologies. This is I'm going to not use this example here. But if you were to hide those, you wouldn't necessarily see all the detail at the 5 meters, and you would see some extra little bumps, like you see this little piece here. When that's a detail that you won't actually see standing in the forest. It's just a little bump 10 centimeters higher than on one side of the line than the other. So if I'm going to do this, I'm going to actually draw my contours, not necessarily on my 5 meter, which would be here, right? That would be on the 5 meter, but I'm actually going to, and again, experience really helps here, but I'm going to actually draw this up a little bit where I'm kind of in the middle of the steeper slope. And then I'm going to draw the line below at about 5. So 5 meters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So then I'm going to draw kind of in here. There's my contour below. Let's add in a slope tag there. And I will do, okay, so this is, yeah, so this here is the next line over. That's also a depression, right? And I'm going to draw this, as much of this in, and I might go through and I might later find, oh shoot, I actually want to shift some of these contours up or down, and I might take a couple of iterations on the most complex sections. But I'm drawing everything in by hand to get nice smooth contours that best represent the terrain. So this is where I'm taking kind of 10 to 12 hours per square kilometer to go through, draw all this by hand, and that's going to give me the most control, but allowing me to not draw what the LiDAR strictly sees, but to take that, interpret that as the orienteer will see it, and represent that as best I can for the folks that are going to be racing, right? Likewise, let me pull up. No, I'm not gonna. I'm gonna keep moving, and if we have time at the end, I can come back and look at a sprint example. So that's the idea with this pre-field work drawing. And then what I think most of you probably consider the fun stuff, which would be the field work. It's where you can actually get out in the terrain, right? So of course, there's the actual getting out in the terrain, the field survey part of it. I can't really give you an example of that while I'm sitting here in front of my screen and sharing my screen with you. There's the drawing of that, both as you go and then filling in some of it when you get back to your desk at the end of the day or at the end of the week. Again, editing, really want to stress how much value that can add and how much better that can make your map. And then with that, of course, sometimes that might involve going back out in the field. And then there's any final drawing and drafting that you might do at the very end. So again, what comes into this? What does it help to know? Your IOF specifications, so your basic symbol definitions, super key, obviously, but also your minimum area and symbol sizes. So what's the smallest area of green that is allowed on a map? What is the smallest area of yellow that's allowed on the map? That kind of thing. And your gaps between cliffs, gaps between symbols of the same color, all of that kind of thing, so that the map is as readable, as legible as possible when printed on a good quality print, right? Of course, having experience doing this helps, obviously, and experience drawing obviously helps as well. But you got to start somewhere. Your first map won't be a map that's going to get used for a U.S. Nationals. Start with a small project, and you can go from there, right? So, want to give an example here of that editing process. So this is my first pass at an area called Cité des Jeunes in Gatineau. So this was, well, at the time, this was my biggest project that I had ever done, and I learned a lot throughout. And so this was my first attempt at it. This was my second pass. So I did an extra, I'm not sure what, an extra 40 or 50 hours on a good chunk of this map, and really kind of changed my approach after some feedback that I had gotten, and some learning of my own as well. So you can kind of see the differences here. And if you line the two up, you can see how I redrew a whole bunch of the contours. If you look at kind of this section, center of, or sorry, right of center, you can see that here I had a bunch of these full contour lines on what is really quite a flat plateau, but there's a bit of a hill kind of here around this black pit. And then the contour line has to go somewhere, but it's really quite subtle and flat on where the rest of that contour is. And so I shifted all my contours and ended up using some form lines on the top, which gives me a little bit more flexibility to draw that. And the thinner form lines kind of de-emphasize some of those really subtle things and allowed me to emphasize the more important stuff elsewhere, right? And drastically changed the stony ground. So this first map is maybe more representative of the stony ground overall, but it really reduces the legibility. So I really instead decided to ended up going with an approach that really just highlighted the rockiest parts of this terrain. So that's where getting some of that feedback and then doing some of that editing can really come into play. And then just another example I wanted to show you of how it's not as simple as just kind of going with your first attempt. So this was something that I had drawn up this past spring, I think it was. Maybe it was a year ago, last winter. And it's a couple of different ways I might draw this. I asked this on a mapping forum on Facebook. Was asking for some feedback on the best approach here on how to represent this. So it just shows a couple of different ways, a couple of different approaches. And I guess the bottom line is try some different things, see what you like. If you're not sure, put it out there to the community, whether it's just a couple of friends or other mappers, and try to find the best way to represent it, right? Don't be afraid to get out there and admit you don't know how to do something and learn as you go. So let's switch into the second half here, which is focusing on how to get started in mapping. So a couple of questions that I want you all to think about for a couple minutes here. So what is your motivation to start mapping? What type of mapping are you interested in? Sprint maps, forest maps, maybe it's ski or mountain bike maps or something else entirely. Do you think you're more interested in the fieldwork side of things or the drawing side of things? Those are kind of, I would say, the two main parts that people are drawn to. And finally, how detail oriented are you? There's no wrong answers to any of these, but it might affect where you want to spend your energy as you get started. So I've got a couple of charts here on the next couple of slides. And unfortunately, we don't have the ability to have everybody draw on this. But if I could get a few of you to maybe suggest where on this chart you think you would fall. So what is your motivation? Are you wanting to get orienteering going in a new area? Or are you interested in learning to map? They are, of course, not mutually exclusive. And then same thing, kind of sprint to forest. So maybe we can get a few of you either shouting that out or throwing that into the chat here, and I'll just throw a few dots up on the screen, get a sense of where everyone is. So I'm going to put you, Mark, here-ish. Top middle. Sounds good. Forest and interested in learning to map. We got somebody over here. We're really spread out. Another top middle. Put another dot over here. Heather, I'm going to put you smack in the middle. Blake in the top right.
Center of the upper right.
Center of the upper right. All right. Somebody in here. Sprint and learning. All right. Not too many people in the upper left quadrant, but we've got some folks fairly spread out here. Joseph, will put you down there. All right. Let's leave that one there, and let's go and look at the next our next slide. So we'll do the same kind of exercise here. And so detail-oriented perfectionist, more of a big picture person. And where do you think you fall? You may not have a good sense yet until you've gotten into it, but you think you're going to enjoy more the drawing. Tends to align with the sprint stuff. You spend a lot of time just doing that detailed drawing, or do you want to get out into the forest and do spend your time in the woods doing the field work? Mark, I think I've got you sort of there-ish. Call it close enough. Trying to keep up here. Bottom right, center of upper right. Big picture, somewhat drawing. Nope, sorry, it's down here. Down in middle. Someone, Joseph at 2 o'clock is over here somewhere. All right, relatively spread out, a little bit more leaning towards the field work. Cool. Well, thank you all for that. I hope that was kind of an interesting exercise for yourself to think about. And as I go through some of these tips to get started, we'll start to make sense of kind of where what this tells you as to where you might want to get started. So I've got a list here of I think eight different tips that we're going to go through. And then we'll open it up to questions. So first tip, I think this one's pretty obvious: get the software and get the hardware, right? So whether you want to use OCAD or Open Orienteering Mapper, and then that's the more major decision, and then you're going to pick what tablet and stylus you might want to use for fieldwork, based on whether you're using OCAD or Open Orienteering Mapper. So OCAD, paid software. Super powerful. You can do your LiDAR processing in OCAD, and I mean, there's a ton of stuff you can do in OCAD, but it is paid. Sometimes clubs will have OCAD licenses available for you to use, so do ask your local club if that is the case, or maybe they don't have one available, but they would be willing to pay for one. I think, I'm not sure the US price. I think the US price is probably $130, $150 a year. But if somebody has a definite answer to that, if you want to throw that in the chat, that would be appreciated. Open Orienteering Mapper is open source software. So it's free, but it's getting developed kind of on and off. There hasn't been a lot of work on it recently. I do my drawing in Open Orienteering Mapper. There's a number of reasons for that. I find I really like the user interface that Open Orienteering Mapper has, but it can't do all the things that OCAD does. So I use OCAD for a few things for setting up my projects. I'll do a lot of that in OCAD, and then I'll switch over to Open Orienteering Mapper for my drawing. Open Orienteering Mapper works on Android, but not. Actually, I think the desktop version, there is a Windows and an Android and a Mac OS version, but there is no version for iPhone or iPad. There's no iOS version. OCAD has OCAD Sketch for fieldwork, which works in iOS and in Android. And then you're going to pick a tablet and a stylus. I actually use a Bluetooth mouse for my own field work, but generally speaking, most people these days are using a stylus that pairs with their tablet. So that's the obvious tip number one. Tip number two, I highly recommend that you start with a small project. You might have a local forest in mind or something, but I recommend that do something that you can do in a week or so, finish it up, and you can learn, you can iterate, start your next project, and learn from the lessons of your first one. Rather than spending a whole year or a couple of years trying to get your first project done, just get that sense of accomplishment from getting that first project done. So this year is a local park in Ottawa and a school, right? So it's the kind of area that I could do the field work for that in a day as an experienced mapper at least. But then you can get it done. You can say, okay, done my first map, learned lots. I can go on to my second one, and still, of course, learn lots. So along with that, my personal recommendation is that it's a lot easier to start with a sprint map. So whether that's a park or a kind of a school campus, something like that. My reason for recommending this is because the mapping is a lot less interpretive, right? So I've got a forest example up on the top. And now I admit, go through my photos and try to find something that kind of highlighted this element. So I purposely picked a complex forest area. What is stony ground? Where do I draw my contours? Where's the edge of the vegetation, right? Because there's clearly lots of stuff going on with vegetation in this photo. So there's a lot of kind of questions there. The sprint area on the bottom, okay, the edge of the water, really clear where that is. There's no guessing there. The tree, put a tree down. Edge of the building is the edge of the building, right? It's a lot more kind of cut and dry. So I highly recommend starting with a sprint map, even if you want to get into forest mapping as your kind of main element. Maybe do your first small project with a forest, get used to some of the mechanics, get used to using the tablet so that you're not trying to figure out the software and the complex field work at the same time. But you can, okay, I've done a project, I know how to use the software a little bit. Now I can get into the more complex field work, right? A couple questions in the chat here. I will get to those at the end. So I do recognize that there's some questions, and I will get to those. So next recommendation. Now this is a bit of a sales pitch. Take some classes. So I've been developing over the last 4 years or so a number of classes to help folks like yourselves get started in mapping. And so I'll actually show my class calendar at the end, but I've got a number of intro to mapping classes that are available on Tuesdays and Thursday evenings starting in late January. And I don't know if John Campbell's on the call here. Many of you might know John. He's going to actually be teaching some of my classes, the OCAD versions of these classes with me this winter. So that should be awesome. The next three are all kind of related. Get feedback. What I mean specifically by get feedback is get feedback from folks running on your maps. It's one thing to get feedback from somebody sitting at a chair, somebody looking at your map on paper, but get somebody to run on your map. Be willing to get feedback after your first event on your map. There's always that can be a little bit scary, because especially with your first map, who knows what kind of feedback you might get. But if you show that you're open about getting good feedback, and you can communicate that, I think people will be willing to give you positive but gentle feedback. Let's put it that way, right? And I would say that's different than these next couple, which is one, finding a mapping partner. So for a long time, I'm doing it a little bit less so now, but I've worked with my good friend Eric Kemp. Many of you might recognize that name, one of Canada's top orienteers these days. He's done a fair bit of mapping himself, and we would always I would work on my project, he would work on his, and we would share our maps with each other and give each other feedback as we went along, and not just at the end, but as I'm going through the process. So I would do half of my drawing, I'd share it with Eric, and he might look at it a little differently and say, oh, what about this, what about that, with both specific comments and examples, but also kind of general stuff. And I would do the same for him, and we both learned a lot from each other as we kind of started and have worked through our mapping journey at kind of a similar timing and similar pace. So if you have somebody, whether it's in your club or elsewhere in the country, that you know that is also getting into mapping, reach out and ask them to look at your maps and offer to look at theirs. Makes a big difference. Find a mentor is the next one. So this is not somebody at the same mapping level as you, but somebody who has more experience and is willing to give some time to that. The challenge with this, of course, is that there's not too many experienced mappers, particularly experienced mappers that have the time to give out there. But if you know somebody and are willing to reach out, that can make a big difference as well. And then finally, I'm going to reiterate this once more. Don't be afraid to edit, especially with your beginning projects. You're going to learn a lot. But even now, I'm learning a lot. And my North American Champs map, the first few days of field work, I went back towards the end and edited it so that my map was consistent across the entire area, the entire 6 square kilometers. And there was parts of it where I drew my contours in one way, got out in the field, went, I don't really like the way those looked, and I redrew them 2 or 3 more times to get something that I was happy with. So it takes a bit of extra time, but it's a part of the learning process, but B, you're going to end up with a better map at the end of the day. So a few mapping resources. I will throw these into the chat as well with the links. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but there's a number of kind of more tools on the left. On the right here, these are more kind of learning resources. So I started a newsletter just recently. Every couple of weeks, I'm sending one out where I do include, one of the things I include is a mapping tip with every newsletter. My classes, obviously, David Bakker is a mapper in BC who's done I think it's about a 3-hour kind of tutorial on using Open Orienteering Mapper, which I know a lot of folks have found helpful and is really very good. Gord Hunter in Florida has created a guide kind of aimed at beginners for just getting started with mapping, putting some data together, and it's a good way to kind of jump in. And then, of course, the mapping specs. The IOF has a map wiki where there's a lot of examples and pictures of the different features that are can be represented with the different symbols. And then finally, a Facebook group here that I think I mentioned earlier. So here's my classes. You can find them navigationsports.ca/courses. So both in OCAD on Thursdays and on Tuesdays, these Open Orienteering Mapper classes. And then I've got a couple of LiDAR classes in late February and early March. So I'm going to just keep going here, jump into the end. We're closer to 45 minutes than 30. So I want to open it up for questions.
This is Mark. Thank you. This was great. Question: if you're starting anew, where would you kind of push us a little bit? OMM or OCAD?
What are you wanting to start with? Are you wanting to do forest projects, leaning more towards LiDAR, obviously using LiDAR then, or are you wanting to focus more on kind of drawing and sprint maps?
Yeah, you asked that, and I said sprint, but I guess I'm just indecisive, so you could smack me in the middle.
Right.
But I like the sprint because, for the reasons you cited, they're very clear. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you have access to OCAD, it would be worth getting OCAD, particularly for like LiDAR, that kind of stuff. And it does have a really nice tool for a map creation wizard, a new map wizard they call it, where you can set it up georeferenced right from the get go. Pull in some data from OpenStreetMap. It's a really quick and easy way to get started. But if cost is an issue, you don't want to pay for OCAD. Open Orienteering Mapper is a good way to go. And again, I do like the Open Orienteering Mapper's user interface for drawing. But at this point, part of that is it's what I'm used to now. So it's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I do think the answer is a little bit, it kind of depends on if you're wanting OCAD, like the LiDAR tools, or if you're really just wanting to do the drawing.
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you.
All right. Okay, Kyle, I'll answer your question, and then I'm going to go back up and look at the questions that we had further up. So, Kyle, how do you use a tablet when you're in the field? So I'm actually using my phone. I'm going to stop sharing sharing my screen here. And so I've just used my phone. I don't know if the folks can see this. And I have, so I'm gonna try to do this. So I pull up Open Orienteering Mapper, and let's just pick this sprint map here. And I have everything on my phone here, and I can pull up, I can set my GPS. It'll show me my GPS. I can scroll around, and then I can do my drawing either with a stylus right on my phone screen, or I use does this show it? Or I use a Bluetooth mouse. You can kind of see the mouse cursor there, and I can do all my drawing. So I can pull up my symbols, and I can do all my drawing and stuff right on the phone. So the phone that I'm using, Matthew, is a standard kind of Samsung Galaxy phone. It's a S21, and yeah, any kind of modern smartphone will do the trick. All right, I said I would go back to these questions that were up here earlier. Are there issues switching between OCAD and Open Orienteering Mapper? From Brian. Brian, yes, there's minor issues, but nothing insurmountable. I would recommend not switching kind of back and forth multiple times through the project. So I start my projects typically in OCAD, get them set up using the various kind of map setup tools that OCAD has, including using the LiDAR processing. And then I port everything over to Open Orienteering Mapper, do all my drawing there. And then if I have a client that's wanting the map in OCAD, I will do a final pass of my drafting in OCAD, because there's a few things that show up differently. So symbols with dashes or tags like fences, that sometimes the tags shift between the Open Orienteering Mapper version of the file and the OCAD version of the file. And then if you go back and forth, you do lose a few things with the background maps or the templates, that you just have to reset them up. So if you set up your background files in a certain order and you've got some transparency settings, you might lose those transparency settings, for example. So not the end of the world by any stretch, but it is a little bit of a pain to go back and forth repeatedly. Does that answer your question, Brian? All right, I'm going to take that as a yes.
So you're using just the built-in GPS on your phone?
I am, yeah. So my feeling is that these days, with the really high quality LiDAR, or even medium quality LiDAR, quite frankly, there isn't really any more, like I can pinpoint for the most part my location from that LiDAR data. using a combination of the very detailed contours. Like I've got these 25 centimeter contours in the hillshade, but also I have my canopy height typically on when I'm doing my field work. So I can see where the big pine trees are. I can see where the little clearings are. And so that gives me enough that I can place my boulders and place where I am relative to those things super, super accurately. So I use the GPS. I do find it typically accurate enough that I'll walk a trail back and forth a couple of times and then draw my trail in from there and make minor adjustments to sometimes the corners kind of get cut off a little bit. And so I'll exaggerate some of the corners and such. But for the most part, yeah, I find I don't need an external GPS.
This is Blake from Florida Orienteering. I've got a question for you, if I can jump in.
Sure, Blake.
I've done maybe a dozen maps or so over the last 3 years, and one of the one of the curiosities of doing digital mapping, of course, is that you have so much control that the temptation is to put a lot on the map. You know, as you're walking around doing the field work, you say, "Oh, that's a really cool distinct tree. That's a really cool boulder. That's a really cool whatever."
Yeah.
And then at the end, when you zoom back out, you end up with a map that's covered in too much stuff because you found too many interesting things to put on it. So my question to you is, do you have a good rule of thumb for like an object density? How many points per unit area? How do you typically rein in that instinct when you're doing your field work?
Really, really interesting and good question. First of all, let me say it's very natural progression to start by overmapping. And I would argue that that's actually not a bad place to start. I would rather see you as a novice mapper. I'd rather see you put more stuff on the map than too few things. And over time, to then start to simplify a little bit and learn how to manage that. Bottom line, and I actually just sent out my second newsletter today. And those of you that, if you want to sign up for my newsletter, you will get this one that I sent out today and the previous one sent to you when you sign up. But I included in there something right on this topic. Bottom line, Blake, is what is your first instinct? Not looking at the feature right beside you, but looking into the distance. What is your first instinct? What is the first thing you see? Start with mapping that and start with generalized. So if I look out there and I see there's a number of boulders out there, for example, in the terrain, do I see 1, 2, 3 boulders? Or do I see a bunch of boulders and I have to kind of stop and count them? If my first instinct is, oh, there's a bunch of boulders and I have to stop and count them, that's probably a good sign that it's worth using the boulder area or the boulder field triangles, right? Because you want to map what orienteers are going to kind of instinctively see and how they're going to instinctively interpret the terrain. I think we tend to overthink and go, oh, here's a feature, here's a feature, here's a feature. But what's my first impression of the area? And try to map to that first impression. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
What else? Any other questions?
How about, do you know of any good, one of the things that I spend a lot of my time on during that initial phase where you have the imagery put in and you're drawing the base map before you do the field work. I spend a lot of time in there hand drawing vegetation boundaries and other things that consume a lot of time. Do you know if there's any automated way of doing that? I keep looking for a tool that can take, for instance, the vegetation map that the LiDAR generates and spit out like a first draft of here's the basic area objects that cover, most of what you got here. Is there anything out there like that?
There's, quite frankly, nothing that I would recommend. There's a few sort of ways that you can kind of workarounds where you can kind of vectorize your drawings and stuff to try to get some of the vegetation and that kind of thing. But that's going to be the literal LiDAR interpretation, and you're going to find flaws in that when you're out doing your field work or when you're out orienteering. And so it's probably not worth the effort for that kind of stuff. So I think the key thing in what you're asking, Blake, is finding the balance of how much work it's worth doing. So as you gain experience, you're going to find that 50% of the time when I draw these features, I'm wrong, and therefore maybe I'll just save it and just do it during my field work, because you need to cover the whole area when you're doing your field work anyway, right? If you're wanting to do a really good job of it. So yeah, does that give you a maybe unsatisfactory answer?
Well, if the answer is there's no good tool out there for this yet, that's a perfectly good answer. I'm just looking to broaden my vision, right? Because I only see what I see, and
yeah, for sure. I'm not aware of anything good for that.
Yeah, just to chime in with my experience, I mean, unless your LiDAR data is brand new, like taken a year ago, which it usually doesn't get published that quickly, you're going to find there have been changes in the vegetation anyway.
Yeah. But the vegetation, like the LiDAR vegetation is not consistent because it's flown leaf off, right? So in the fall after the leaves have fallen, which may or may not be an issue in Florida. I'm not familiar with the terrain down there. But in which case you get the areas of, if you've got kind of evergreen saplings, those will show up as pretty thick green, but you might have something that is really quite thick in the summer, but because the leaves are off, the LiDAR doesn't pick it up. And so it shows that as perfectly white. And so you get this kind of inconsistency of some patches of green are shown, but not others, even if it is up-to-date LiDAR.
There's definitely some peculiarities in Florida, especially palmetto thickets and palmetto trees, because they have such broad leaves that the LiDAR tends to interpret that as denser than it really is on the ground. And there are other ones like that as well. But
yeah.
But overall, the LiDAR vegetation in Florida is often quite good, at least in the sense that, it may not be really fight in there, but if you just look at the relative density is often quite good. If you follow the lighter areas, those really are the lighter areas in the terrain.
Right.
You just got to dial the level up or down to the right density.
Yeah.
I have a question about when you're using Open Orienteering Mapper in the field. So I'm assuming that you face the way your phone is oriented north, is oriented accurately when you're looking out into the terrain. So do you leave the setting so that it automatically keeps north, or do you freeze it and rotate your phone?
I freeze it and rotate my phone / myself if needed. The problem is that it moves on you, and so you can't like draw a line and because the map is jumping around as you're trying to do your drawing, and it just doesn't work.
It's
Yeah.
super annoying. Yes.
The thing that I've asked for, and maybe other people could ask for it, is that the same button that turns it on and off, it only changes when you click the button. It doesn't stay on. So you can face the direction you want to face. You can click the button and it'll orient, but then it won't do it until you click the button again.
Right. So it has two modes. It has either north is to the top of the screen or north is to north, but you can't freeze it at north as a certain angle.
I know. That's the
I think
problem.
what you're getting at. And
That's
yeah,
what
that would be a cool feature for sure. For sure.
What I've done is I've got a harness that I wear that holds my tablet, and it's on it rotates, so I can just rotate the tablet to north up.
Right.
What kind of tablet are you using?
I'm using a Samsung ruggedized tablet, and it's terrific. It's heavy, but it's terrific. I was in the rain, and it only reacts to the stylus, so you can work on it with water dripping on it.
Nice.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe offline, could you send me a link to the harness that you're talking about? I
made it. I'll send you a picture of it.
You made it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
So we're just a little over an hour now, which is our theoretically scheduled time. If people want to jump in with one more question or raise their hands now, maybe we'll try to deal with whatever questions there are, and then we'll call it a night. So, anyone with a last question or two?
Robert?
You're muted, Robert. Maybe you're putting it into the chat.
Okay, that's better.
Yeah.
So, do you, early in the presentation, you demonstrated drawing the contours.
Yeah.
Do you ever use the contours straight as they are generated from OCAD? Do you always do that step?
I always do that step, yes. Yeah.
Is that common? Is that... What do other people do that? I kind of got the sense, I haven't done any real championship level mapping, and I've done local mapping, school mapping, and things like that. And I've just used the contours as they come off OCAD. Now, is that something I should change, or is that something it's okay to continue?
I mean, it does depend a bit on the kind of terrain you're in. So the terrain that I do most of my mapping in, it can be quite complex, and I would not recommend using the LiDAR contours as it is. If you're in kind of European continental terrain where you've got, 20 contours, parallel contours in a row, the terrain is pretty smooth, you could probably get away with using smoothed, but basically the LiDAR contours as they are. In that case, I would probably recommend using the Karttapullautin contours, which has a better smoothing algorithm than other things. But for complex terrain, you're either going to want to do what I do and draw all your contours from hand from the start, or like John Campbell, for example, I know tends to start with the Karttapullautin contours, but does a lot of work adjusting them manually by hand. Whereas I don't bother with starting with them. I just draw them by hand from the start because I can shift them up and down. I can adjust them a little bit. I can exaggerate them in places to better show what the orienteer is going to see in the forest.
Yeah, just to chime in, I've done maps starting from Karttapullautin contours and I've done them starting from OCAD contours, like smoothed with the default settings, and I always find myself adding back in contour detail that way. And I have to do that in the field or make notes in the field on where I need to add the detail back. So I've come around to thinking it's better to draw them from the unsmoothed contours, to draw them by hand in the first place. Someone asked in the chat if there was a single best resource you would recommend consulting for it. I mean, back in the days when fieldwork was something to do with Mylar and pencils, you could say there was no, what was it, map making for orienteers was the resource everyone should read. I'm not is there an equivalent these days, Jeff?
If you're wanting, I mean, best single piece of advice, I would probably go with find a mentor and or take those classes. But it's really hard to narrow that down to a single piece of advice. I mean, get out there and try it. And yeah, your first map is not going to be pretty, but that's part of the learning process, right? So don't be afraid to just go out there, get started, give it a shot, and share it with people and get feedback.
Well, OCAD's got a stack of tutorials.
Yes, there's all sorts of tutorials and help files. I think the real key is in the field work, and that's where most of those there's less resources on the field work side of things.
Okay, so with that, I think we should call it a night. Thank you very much, Jeff, for giving the talk.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Thanks everyone for turning out for it and having questions. Happy holidays, everyone. See you at forums in the new year.
If there are any other tablet mappers out there who want to hang out for just a minute, I've got other questions to pick your brains about if you want to chat.
Yes, we'll probably, I think we'll stop recording at this point, though.
That's fine.
Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome.